I want to talk with you about setting goals that are based on your values. I suspect that when you hear that, you think we're going to talk about goals for how to live your life. We're not. We're actually going to talk about goals for the end of life. That's not a conversation anybody wants to have. It's frightening, it's depressing. Nobody wants to talk about death. Doctors don't want to talk about death either. That's one of the reasons why the first explicit conversation I ever had about death happened at 10:30 at night in the waiting room of the intensive care unit about 3 weeks after I graduated from medical school. I'd been sent down there to talk to a family I'd never met about their mother, who was a patient in that intensive care unit. She was dying. They didn't know that, and it was my job to tell them. I walked in the room, I introduced myself, and I said, "We need to talk about the ventilator that's helping your mother breathe, because it's really not effective for her anymore, and she's going to die." I remember that conversation with horror, and I can only imagine how that family remembers it. I've spent the rest of my career, the last 30 years, trying to learn how to do this better and to teach other people to do it better as well. We know we need to do it better because when we ask, we know we're not serving people in the way that they want to be served. Repeated surveys have told us that the majority of Americans, given a choice, want to die at home, comfortably, with a minimum of medical intervention. But in 2014, 65% of people who died in the United States died in care, either in a hospital or a nursing home, and 10 to 20% of those died in the intensive care unit. We're not doing this very well. Over the years, one of the things I've learned is that we need to do it somewhere else other than the intensive care waiting room. We need to do it well before anybody gets into the intensive care unit. We need to plan ahead. Thanks to the work of Bob Arnold and Tim Quill, I've also learned that we need to start the conversation differently than we usually do. Ideally, should be an opportunity to sit down in an examining room or a consultation room or your own home with a doctor or somebody who can help you through this. And when I do this, I start out by saying, "Tell me about yourself. What's important to you? What does a really good day look like? What are your goals for your medical care?" What I'm really asking, what I really want to know, is what does quality of life mean to you? Because that answer is going to be different for everybody. Some people feel that in order to have an acceptable quality of life, they have to be able to move around independently. Other people will say, if I can communicate, if I can have a meaningful interaction with my friends and family, then I don't care if I need assistance to move around. That's acceptable to me. It's very individual. It's different for everybody. And that's what I need to know. And once I've figured that out, then I can say, okay, now let's talk about medical technology. And I'll tell you what technology will help you meet those goals and what technology we really should put aside because it's not going to get you where you want to go. If we do that planning ahead, then when the crisis comes, we can make the right choices. If we do that planning ahead, we have to put it in writing. It's essential to put it in writing for a number of reasons. One is that it provides guidance to your medical team, to the people who are taking care of you when you're seriously ill, about both what you want done and who you want to speak for you if you're unable to speak for yourself. Putting it in writing means creating both a living will and naming a healthcare proxy or surrogate, also called a durable power of attorney. In Pennsylvania, both of those documents are absolutely essential because Pennsylvania has put legislation in place that tells us as physicians what to do if we don't have those documents. It tells us who your legal next of kin is if you haven't named anybody and you're unable to make your own decisions. If you're legally married, even if you're estranged from your spouse is your legal next of kin, and that's the person that I have to listen to who will direct your medical care. If you're married, but you have adult children from a previous relationship, they have equal standing in that decision, and we have to go by majority rule. It's not a position people want to find themselves in. It's not a position anybody wants to put their family in. And in order to avoid that, you have to put it in writing. The living will says, these are the interventions I want if I am terminally ill, if I am coming to the end of my life, and these are the interventions I don't want. In Pennsylvania, the state has put on the books that they're going to assume that everybody, regardless of their medical condition, will want a feeding tube unless they have information in writing otherwise. Many people feel strongly that that's not what they want. You have to put it in writing. If you do that, then when that moment comes, the people taking care of you and the people who love you can make the decisions you'd want them to make. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of taking care of a woman who suffered through cancer 3 times. The first time, she was in her early 70s, she was healthy, she got diagnosed, she had chemo, she did well, cancer went away, she was fine. Several years later, the cancer recurred, she had chemotherapy again. It was a little rougher that time, but she got through it, she survived, and she was okay. The third time, I got a letter from the oncologist that says, well, the cancer has returned and we're going to start chemotherapy. I thought, I wonder about that. At this point, the woman was in her early 80s. Her husband had died a few years before. She was increasingly frail. She could no longer live on her own. So I called and invited her to come into the office to discuss this with me. And she did. She brought her 2 daughters with her. And I said to her, so what do you think about this? And she said, I don't want to do it. I've been waiting for somebody to tell me that I don't have to do it. This conversation took place on Friday. Chemotherapy was scheduled to start the following Monday, and nobody had asked. But because she and I had had this conversation, and I was pretty sure I knew what her goals were and what her values were, I was able to shift her care out of the chemotherapy and into hospice, which was what she wanted and what her family supported. We've talked about planning ahead. We've talked about putting it in writing. And we've talked about doing all that so that in a moment of crisis, we can do the right thing. But we don't always know that it's a moment of crisis. It's not always so clear-cut. We're going to start chemotherapy. It doesn't always happen like that. Chronic diseases are, well, chronic. They go on for a long time. They change gradually. People live with heart disease and lung disease and neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease for years. They take medication, they get treatment, they function pretty well. And then something changes. The treatment stops working. They end up in the hospital. Things have to get changed. And we don't always know that change means we're coming to the end. Doctors don't always know. And even when doctors do know, they're often hesitant to say so. They don't want to upset anybody, and doctors don't like to talk about death. So what do you do if you're in that situation? You have to ask the right questions. You have to ask, what will my life look like if I do this treatment? What will my life look like if I don't do this treatment? How do you know that this treatment will be effective for me? Doctors have a lot of experience in dealing with large numbers. We can tell you that this treatment is effective for 70% of the people in your situation. Ask how they know that you fall into that 70%. And ask what would happen if you did nothing at all. How many of you are familiar with Atul Gawande's book On Being Mortal? Yeah. Book came out about 3 years ago. Gawande is a cancer surgeon up in Boston. I read the book because I knew people would have expected me to read the book. I didn't want to read the book. At that point, I'd been practicing as a hospice medical director for a number of years, and I didn't really see what anybody had to teach me about end-of-life care, even some guy from Harvard. I was wrong. For one thing, the book is exquisitely written and worth reading for that alone. But for another, I actually did learn something about end-of-life care. In addition to the questions that I had always asked about quality of life and goals and values, Gawande offered me two more. He said, ask what outcome is unacceptable to you. What outcome would take the treatment completely off the table? And ask, what trade-offs are you willing to make? What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to suffer through for the outcome that you want? And those questions transformed my practice. One of the things that surprised me about that book was that Gawande had been practicing as a cancer surgeon for a number of years before he met the patient whose case drove him to look at treatment at the end of life. He'd been in practice all that time, and he'd never heard of palliative care. When he went looking for answers for his patient, he turned to a palliative care colleague at Dana-Farber in Boston, and suddenly he learned about our discipline. I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been. Most people don't know about palliative care. Those who do think it's only for people with cancer, or it's only for people at the very end of their lives when there's nothing more they can do for you, and they send you the palliative route, as someone said to me the other day. That's not true. Palliative care is a discipline that offers care for people at any point in the course of a serious illness. They can help people feel better, they can help reduce symptoms, they can help improve function throughout treatment. And they can help with those very difficult decisions, with those questions that it's so hard to ask. They can help you get the information you need from your doctors to make the decisions that are best for you. Anybody facing serious or potentially life-threatening illness could benefit from a discussion with the palliative care team. Nobody wants to have these conversations. But having those conversations and making these plans can be absolutely the greatest gift you can give to your family. My mother died a couple of months ago after living with dementia for a long time. And because we had this conversation when she was capable of expressing her wishes, my brother and I knew exactly what she wanted and exactly what she did not want. That made it possible for her to die comfortably at home in her own bed. And for my brother and I to know completely and for sure that we did the right thing. There's tremendous peace in that knowledge. And it is a gift that she gave us. And is it a gift? It is a gift that you can give your loved ones as well. Nobody likes to talk about death, but when we do, better things can happen because you're the expert on your values and your goals and your quality of life. And I'm the expert on what medical technology can get you there and when it can't. And when those two things are combined, that's when the best medical care happens, because your values matter most. Thank you.